Well, I'll get us started then. My name's Oliver Dodd. I'm a co-director here at the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice, which is a research centre based at the University of Nottingham. And I'm very pleased to see so many people here today and to be able to present our main speaker, who is Professor Andreas Bieler, who's also an activist as well as a professor of political economy. So he's got this distinction. Andreas has been writing about political economy for some 2 decades, but a couple of his most recent books is Global Capitalism, Global War and Global Crisis, published by Cambridge University Press with his colleague Adam Morton in 2018. Andreas's most recent book which will be the topic of today's discussion, is called Fighting for Water, Resisting Privatisation in Europe. And this was published by Zed Books earlier this year in June. Today, Andreas will be talking for about 40 minutes. And after this, we'll follow this with a Q&A discussion. And so, yeah, I'm very pleased to be able to have Andreas with us today. Please, over to you, Andreas.
Yes, thanks a lot, Oliver, for the kind introduction. Good evening to everyone, also from my side. So the title of my presentation is Fighting for Water, Resisting Privatization in Europe. And that's the same title of the book, which Oliver already mentioned. So, okay. There we are. So by way of introduction, why should we privatize water? Yeah, what is the dominant argument about it? And on the right-hand side, you see the names of some of the key water privatizers. So you have here the French giants, Veolia and Suez, but you also have the infamous British company Thames Water or the Italian company Acea Aqua. And so what's the general argument in favor of why should we privatize water? And according to neoliberal economists, there would be 4 positive effects as a result of privatization, purely due to the fact that we introduce market competition, the competition of the free market. Now, as a result of privatization, first of all, the service provision would be more efficient. Yes, when the contract is opened up for public tender, different companies compete with each other. And of course, in order to get the contract, each tries to outbid the other one by being the most efficient provider. Fantastic. Who could argue with that? Absolutely fantastic. Yeah, we would go ahead with that, no problem. But thanks to market competition, not only would water provision be more efficient, but it would also be of higher quality because, again, companies compete with each other. Who can get the bid, the public tender? And of course, you want to give your best possible bid, and that includes, of course, high levels of quality. Fantastic. There's a third positive result. There would be a reduction in costs for consumers because, again, thanks to this competition, companies want to get a contract. Which company gets it? Well, the one which offers the cheapest service. Excellent. Yeah, from a consumer point of view, who could argue with that? And finally, as long as you give water the right price, in inverted commas, the outcome of water management would also be more sustainable for the environment. So you've got 4 fantastic results due to privatization, due to the magic of the free market competition. So who could argue with that? Yeah, but there has been extensive research by colleagues from the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam or by researchers from the Public Services International Relations Research Unit in Greenwich University, which has demonstrated that none of those assumed positive results are actually occurring in reality. Yeah, When water was privatized in Italy, for example, in some cities in central Italy from the late 1990s, early 2000 onwards, customers experienced water increases, price increases by 100%, if not more. Very often, water provision is not more efficient and of higher quality because private companies trying to maximize profit don't invest enough in the necessary infrastructure to maintain the provision of water and sanitary services. Yeah, it's highly expensive actually to ensure that the water which we receive from the tap can actually be directly consumed. And unless you invest enough, the quality is soon going to decline. And in practice, whenever private providers came into the mixture of this managing of water services, quality and efficiency deteriorated. And of course, also when it comes to environment, wherever the profit motive is triumphing is the most important aspect, nature is first to suffer. So private water is also in practice not more sustainable. Ultimately, this kind of economic rationales for why we should privatize water are simply, one could argue, a kind of an ideology to justify the privatization in support of the interest of these large water corporations. And what really is happening when we look at water privatization is that there's a focus on the maximization of profits. And this is the one area in which these private corporations have been extremely successful. Yeah? So they have siphoned off, in a way, public money into private profits. That's what water privatization is all about. However, the book is not predominantly about the power of capital and about these private water corporations. The book is about successful moments of resistance against privatization. So in the book, I'm going to look at the Italian campaign around the referendum against water privatization in 2011, which was successful by ensuring that more than 50% of the electorate participated, and those who participated, more than 95%, voted against water privatization. I look at the European Citizens Initiative, Water is a Human Right, 2012 and 2013, when across the European Union, more than 1.9 billion signatures were collected in favor of the Citizens Initiative of Water is a Human Right, forcing the Parliament as well as European Commission in publishing statements on how water is being dealt with across the European Union. I then moved to the water struggles in the Greek cities of Thessaloniki and Athens. Yeah, against the background of the Eurozone financial crisis, every kind of public asset in Greece has been privatized. But thanks to these struggles in the cities against the privatization of water, the water companies of Athens and Thessaloniki are still in public hands. And finally, I look in the book at the struggles against the introduction of water charges in Ireland between 2014 and 16. An introduction of water charges, while citizens were actually already paying for water through general taxation, an introduction of water charges, which many perceived to be the first steps towards privatization. And again, this is an example of a successful struggle against privatization. In 2016, the Irish government was left with no alternative but to give up on its plans to introduce these charges in view of the widespread opposition. So really, in the book, I'm looking at these successful struggles against water privatization. And the question really is, why is it in the sector of water that struggles against restructuring have been successful, when in many other areas, these struggles had often failed? Before I move towards answering this question, I want to talk briefly about the underpinning theoretical concepts of this research project. And I want to start off with by arguing that we need to think in terms of a necessary historical materialist moment. Now, why would that be the case? Why would I approach these struggles from a historical materialist perspective rather than from an interest group study or social movement-based analysis? But first of all, it is only through a focus on the social relations of production, I argue, that we can understand the particular historical specificity of capitalism, the historical epoch in which we live. The key question we are confronting at our moment in time is, why is it that the economic and the political, the market and the state appear to be separate, with discussions over should the state intervene into the market or should it withdraw from the market? Why is this separation appearing there when prior to capitalism, feudalism, there was a direct overlapping of economic and political matters, and exploitation was directly enforced politically when the feudal law told the peasant how much he or she was to give up from their annual harvest. And drawing on Marx, the answer is that we really need to look at the way of how production is organized in capitalism in order to answer this question. And by being organized around wage labor and the private ownership of the means of production, it is no longer necessary to politically enforce the exploitation, the accumulation of surplus value. Because those who do not own the means of their own social reproduction, they are left with no alternative but to sell their labor power. And it's this indirect enforcement of exploitation, which is characteristic of our capitalist historical epoch, and which underpins this apparent separation of the economic and the political. And it is this focus on the social relations of production which then allows us to highlight the key capitalist structuring conditions. And the first is that capitalism is, of course, enormously dynamic. It's not just workers who compete with each other for employment, but it's also employers who constantly are in competition for market share. And if you are not successful as an employer in that competition, you are left with no alternative but to go bankrupt. And so because of this competition, there's the constant focus on technological innovation, trying to outcompete each other. And of course, one employer moves ahead, others catch up shortly afterwards. And that makes capitalism enormously dynamic. But this is also the reason for why capitalism is crisis prone. Because if everybody tries to produce more based on more novel and better technology with fewer workers, ultimately you end up in these crises of overproduction or crises of overaccumulation. And there's no escape from that. That's a structuring condition. And so capitalism, while dynamic, is also crisis prone. And in order to overcome these crises, capitalism constantly has to expand outward along lines of uneven combined development. And in a way, this is where the pressure for water privatization comes from, because we are currently in a moment of a crisis of overaccumulation, where lots of private cash is sloshing around in the system, desperately searching for profitable investment opportunities. And public water systems services are one of the key investment points where quite enormous amounts of profits can be reaped by private capital. This is where the pressure for privatization of water services comes from. But of course, many people would now say, hold on a second. Does this Marxist historical materialist approach then not imply that you employ an undue focus on the workplace and on wage labor when it comes to key agents of resistance? Is that not rather narrow as a perspective? And here I would argue, in a second step, we need to acknowledge that capitalist accumulation does not only depend on wage labor, but as social reproduction theorists remind us, it equally depends on the expropriation of unpaid labor in the sphere of social reproduction. And that's directly relevant for water. Yeah, because of course, water is not just a kind of an industrial sector with employment. Water is also something on which we all depend in our general life, in the sphere of social reproduction. And struggles for water are not just taking place at the workplace, but they're also taking place in the community with citizens' committees and social movements struggling for their access to affordable, drinkable water. And so in a way, these struggles around water don't just take place in the sphere of production, but they take place in the sphere of production as well as social reproduction. Secondly, capitalist accumulation also depends on ongoing primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession of indigenous land and people. And we know in North America, for example, the struggles over the North Dakota access pipeline at Standing Rock. This is one of those examples where we can see that primitive accumulation is continuing, and the struggles of indigenous people against their expropriation is, of course, also part of these wider water struggles. And so when we look at class struggles around exploitation and the privatization of water, these indigenous struggles equally are part of the wider picture. And finally, capitalist accumulation also depends on the expropriation of cheap nature. And water is one key example of such a cheap nature. Because when we come, for example, to bottled water, yeah, it's almost pumped for free out of the ground, transformed into a commodity, put into plastic bottles, and then sold widely at extra high profits. Equally, yeah, when we think about mining and the extractive industry, there's a lot of usage of water, which is basically taken for free in the production of tar sand oils, just to mention one example. And again, so we can see how struggles against these kind of environmental destructions are equally part of wider class struggles over exploitation and resistance, also when it comes to struggles over water. And so conceptually, the book is really based on class struggle as the heuristic device in which the internal relations between various forms of exploitation and resistance can be revealed. Now, coming to the empirical part of the book, drawing on this historical materialist perspective. Why is it that water has been such a successful area of resistance when many other areas didn't see this kind of success? And I think there are three key reasons we can identify here. First of all, it's the unique quality of water. And here on the left, you can see a photo where an Italian priest reads the Sunday Mass with the water flag draped across the altar. And it's quite clear that water in many religions plays a fundamental role as a key source of life, as the source of life. And even people on the center right who would normally vote for conservative parties would argue that no, when it comes to water, there nobody should be able to make a profit. And so it's this unique quality of water which was also underpinning the success of these water struggles, which was one of the reasons why in Italy, for example, large parts of the Catholic Church were very much part of the water movement around the 2011 referendum. The second key reason for success is the long history of water struggles across different scales. At the bottom on the right-hand side, you see a mural of the Bolivian city of Cochabamba. And it was here that in 2000, in the so-called water war, the people rose up and drove off the private water provider which had come in and suddenly appropriated the whole water sources and tried to sell it at high profits to the local population at prices which meant that some people had no longer access to water. Of course, for the people of Cochabamba, this was a very local event. But for the wider water movement across the world, this gained a kind of an international level of importance. So in 2003, when the first Alternative World Water Forum was held in the Italian city of Florence, Latin American activists came together with local activists from central Italian municipalities. And during this encounter, the Italian activists suddenly realized, oh, look at that. People in Latin America, they are actually confronting the same kind of companies, the same kind of pressures which we encounter here in our local Italian context. And it was this encounter with this international level development of Cochabamba with the local level in Italy, which then convinced Italian activists that they also had to step up their game and move to the regional as well as national level. And it was from then onwards that the Italian Forum at the national Italian level was established in 2006. Now, moving forward in the story, after the successful referendum in Italy in 2011, the European Federation of Public Service Unions then concluded that considering how successful Italian activists had been in the area of water, that they would now move ahead with the European Citizens Initiative across the EU. They felt confident, considering the Italian example, that they could also be successful. And this was then when these 1.9 million signatures across the European Union were collected and concluded in the first successful European Citizens Initiative. In turn then, it was local activists from the Greek city of Thessaloniki which followed the proceedings in the European Parliament via video link when the parliamentarians had to respond to the successful initiative. And these activists from Thessaloniki were so impressed by the way of how the water activists from the European Citizens Initiative held these politicians to account that they concluded, yes, we too want to have a referendum at our local level. And in May 2014, they organized in their city their own referendum. And again, by a large majority of over 95%, the participating citizens rejected water privatization of their municipal company. So we can see how from the Italian national level, this water movement moved towards the European level and then right down to the local level in Thessaloniki. The referendum outcome in Thessaloniki, combined with a ruling by the Greek Constitutional Court, then left the Greek state with no alternative but to abandon water privatization in 2014, in the summer of 2014. Now coming to Ireland, and this is a picture in the right-hand top corner, water wasn't really on the agenda during the European Citizens Initiative. Only when in 2014, the Irish government announced that it wanted to introduce private meters, water meters, as a preparation for charging for water usage, people rose up. And they had a combination of three different tactics. Now, on the one hand, you had large demonstrations in Dublin, numbering 1 million people at one stage, which is enormous for the sorry, it was 100,000. Got to correct myself there, which is enormous for a country such as Ireland. But this was combined with a non-payment campaign, as well as direct resistance of the installation of water meters. So when the companies came and wanted to install water meters in front of various houses, people simply jumped into the holes in order to ensure that the water meter is not being installed. And the combination of those three techniques was so powerful that ultimately in 2016, the Irish state had no alternative but to abandon the idea of introducing water charges. And finally, the third reason for success were the broad alliances on which these water struggles were based. So first of all, there were trade unions, and they organized, of course, in the industrial sector of water services. And trade unions realized that the moment you start privatizing certain sectors, there will be downward pressure on wages and working conditions. So that's why trade unions were opposed. But they also realized that actually water was not just something which affected their members at the workplace, but equally their members when they went home in the sphere of social reproduction. So these trade unionists realized that they can't just focus on a workplace issue, but they also have to look at the issues of wider society. And by doing that, they recognized that water was really an issue which transcended the separation of production and social reproduction. And equally, of course, on the other hand, we had a whole range of developmental NGOs for which water was an essential issue, especially when it came to, for example, the foreign policy of the European Union when negotiating trade agreements with countries elsewhere in the world. Or environmental NGOs, which realized that the moment when you have the profit motive coming in, the environment was to suffer. And on the right-hand side, you see the logo of the Lega Ambiente in Italy, which was heavily involved in the struggles. But also, especially, trade unions combined their struggles with social movements and citizens' committees, which directly organized within the sphere of social reproduction. Because it was these citizens' committees which were formed in opposition to these increases in water charges of often by 100, if not more %, the moment a private provider had moved in. And interestingly, in these struggles across production and social reproduction, in these struggles, many activists told me that over time, having been initially a trade unionist or an environmental activist, they've transformed into water activists and formed a much more homogeneous kind of alliance of forces against privatization than there had been at the outset. So a lot of solidarity is often also created in the process of struggle, and these water struggles are a clear example in this respect. Now, when approaching the struggles over water privatization from a historical materialist point of view, my interest was not only to look at why these struggles were so successful, but also to focus on potential transformative alternatives of how water could be managed differently. And again, we can only do that if we have an approach which understands the historical specificity of the epoch we are dealing with. And it is this historic materialist perspective which then allows me to look at the potential transformative potential of these water struggles. And it was especially in the Italian context that this notion of water as a commons emerged as an alternative. Because Italian activists realized that simply to say, oh, we don't want the private provision of water, let's stick with the state, that was not going to be good enough in the Italian context, because citizens had very often experienced rather inefficient, ineffective delivery of public services. Something just because it is publicly provided doesn't mean that it is well provided. In the Italian context, something else had to be offered. And water as a commons was put forward by activists as the alternative. As a commons, something which you manage jointly, which you enjoy jointly, but which you also preserve for future generations jointly. And so the commons, combined with an emphasis on new forms of democracy, was really put forward as this alternative. Yeah, because if you join something in common and you want to manage it jointly, then you also need different ways of how to manage the governance of these commons. And this then led to concrete forms of new forms of democracy, experimenting with new forms of democracy. And we can see that in the Italian context, but also in the Greek city of Thessaloniki, or in local water communities in Ireland, where people actually experimented with new forms of democracy. And of course, a different way of how ownership is organized, combined with a different way of how this jointly owned commons is then actually governed, that does at least indicate some new form of how the economy is organized, which goes beyond capitalism. At least there are some glimpses of a potential alternative which could emerge in the future. And the key question then is, what about a potential expansion to other sectors? If we treat water as a commons, why shouldn't local public transport, education, health services, why shouldn't they be dealt with as a commons too? Now, in practice, the focus on the commons retreated a bit in the background. When I spoke to an activist from Athens, he told me, well, look, we are providing water for 5 million citizens. How can we treat this water company as a commons where everybody has an equal say? How can we integrate 5 million people in the governance if we treat the company as a commons? And so in practice, we've seen a focus on how we can democratize these public water companies. Yeah, how can we ensure that the interests of workers and user groups are brought on board? And so there have been a number of concrete experiments in Naples, for example, in Paris, and most recently, and perhaps most interestingly, also in the Catalonian city of Terrassa, where they have established a water observatory, which is to advise the company board of how water should be managed in a different way, including also social aspects in this management, in this governance of water. And when we come here to Britain, actually, not just for water, but actually for all kinds of services, utilities, and generally, there's this British campaign group, We Own It. And they've actually provided a blueprint, when we own it, of how we could organize the governance of these industries in a different way in order to ensure a more direct democratic participation by the public in the management of these services, such as water, such as rail transport. And interestingly, I think, you cannot predict how the future is going to develop. But of course, the moment we start democratizing the running of certain services, and the public then realizes the positive results of this democratization, who knows, why should we not go further in our democratization of the running of the economy? And I just want to quote here from this report by We Own It: public ownership of public services is just one part of the jigsaw. Creating a more democratic economy is a bigger task. It will mean a number of alternative models of ownership. It will mean community wealth building across the country. It will mean unleashing cooperatives. It will mean public platforms owned and controlled by the people. It will mean tackling the vast inequality of housing and land distribution across the UK. And that's again where this transformative potential beyond capitalism becomes visible. Because if we start successfully democratizing the running of certain services such as water, who knows who is stopping us to expand that into other areas. Now, as a final comment, and that of course puts perhaps a bit of dampener on it, when I gave the presentation in a different environment, a knowledgeable activist from the European water movement asked me, Andreas, but how on earth can you call the Italian water referendum a success? Look at what has happened since the referendum. Yeah, the results of the referendum, many would argue, probably rightly, have never been fully implemented. If at all, in different ways, more sophisticated ways, one could say, there are renewed pressures for privatization today. Yeah, municipalities are starved of money, driven into the corner, and often left with no alternative when reflecting on privatizing services such as water. So how can you call the Italian water referendum a success? And first of all, of course, we should acknowledge that as a result of the successful referendum, it is the case that no further privatizations took place in Italy since 2011. The pressure is mounting. There are temptations, but no further privatizations took place. So there is the success. But at the same time, of course, we have to acknowledge that capital always comes back for another attempt. There's never a final victory within capitalism. Yeah, they will not give up. You can prevent capital from privatizing areas such as water in a struggle. 4 or 5 years later, they may come for another attempt. And activists on the ground, whether in Italy or in Ireland or elsewhere, they are aware of these dynamics. There are also very concerning developments that water has now been started to be quoted on the stock exchange in Chicago, the distribution of water in California. There's this idea, provided we give the right price to water, then suddenly we can deal with scarcity. And of course, what that results in is only profit-making, speculative profit-making in dealing with futures in water. And that, of course, is a concern because water increasingly is also being financialized, and that undermines the possibility of a public management of resources such as water. And there are renewed efforts around so-called smart water by private companies adopting this kind of rhetoric that they too want to contribute to ensuring that water can be a human right, that they too can ensure in the best possible, to participate in the best possible management of water sources. And so they emphasize the potential introduction of new technology in order to manage water well most efficiently. And if you go onto the websites of Suez and Veolia, for example, they look like being at the very forefront of kind of an alternative management of water. Yeah, they say we are the guarantors of access to water, of the human right to water. And of course, again, this is part of a much more sophisticated campaign by capitalism to participate in profit making when it comes to water management. And so ultimately, the conclusion is that la lotta continua. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk, Andreas. I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody here. One of the difficult things when you're online is that you don't hear a round of applause, but I really enjoyed that very much. I'm sure many other people did. We're going to move on to a Q&A now, and we can do the Q&A in two ways. You can either ask the question directly to Andreas by unmuting yourself, ideally on video, so we can get a bit of a social environment, you know, seem more like a seminar. But you can also ask the question via chat at the bottom, and I'll have my good friend Tony Burns to be watching the chat to see if there's any questions coming through. So who would like to ask the first question to Andreas? Chun-Yi, that's great. Yeah. You're able to unmute yourself. So if you'd like to ask Andreas directly, that'd be no problem.
Thank you. I always think that the first question would be able to just inspire our audience to have better questions. So my question is just a starting point. Andreas, thank you so much for your good presentation. And I have two questions to consult. From your book and your presentation, I gathered the water struggle and the movements are based in European countries. And I just, because I watched a documentary about the Flint water, is in Michigan lake in the States. It was also a quite controversy of the situation of the water. And I was just wondering that, of course, it's not in terms of the area wise that you're covered, but since the water issue, I would say that's probably, if you are encounter with that kind of the situation, would you have some observational comments of the Flint River, Flint water, the situation there, if you happen to have any, because that was to me was a quite powerful documentary for my knowledge, and it happened in a rather more, sort of, you would assume that was a much better time. It was in Obama's presidency. But still a quite disappointing situation happened and still not quite yet resolved of the Flint water. So this is the first question in terms of the states, USA's situation. And the second question is not in relation to area, but more so in terms of if you look into if comparing of the different kinds of the struggle, which we've worked together on the manufacturer in China of the IT sector, and now you are talking about or presenting of the comments of the water, the sector. Do you find any similarity or dissimilarity in terms of the production involved of labor, the struggle, and the fight for the common essential water, electricity, or energy, like in terms of what are the differences and similarity, if you would be able to give pointers, because it's just out of my curiosity to see whether the fight for the struggle involve labor into the production and in terms of the essential goods. So my two starting point questions in order to get more better questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chun-Yi. Very, very good question to start off with. And it's good you refer to Flint in the United States. And of course, that's one of the examples where we can see very well how exploitation in capitalism is also racialized. Yeah, because this water situation in Flint affects especially people from a non-white background, the poorer non-white communities, they suffer predominantly in Flint from that situation. And that's important when I say that water struggles are so successful, because they happen at different scales and across different geographical scales. Water activists are in constant contact with each other. That could be observed within the European context, but as I mentioned, it was also at this Alternative World Water Forum in Florence in 2003 that these Latin American activists came together with local activists from Italy, and that then sparked the kind of next developments within the Italian context. And so during the protest against the introduction of water charges in Ireland, Irish activists invited activists from the so-called Detroit Water Brigade, who came to Ireland and spoke at the big demonstrations and argued that, look, we in Detroit, we are an example of what you will face if you have your services privatized, where you suddenly no longer where those who cannot pay for water simply have their access to water switched off. And so again, we can see how those struggles, they seem to be very separate in different parts of the world, but how they're ultimately very closely connected. And of course, the expropriation, the exploitation of people follows the same kind of rationale. Yeah, this relentless pressure for capital to expand outward into new areas of profitable investment. Yeah. And that drives privatization in the United States, and it drives privatization pressures in Europe. Now, what's the difference of when we look at involvement of workers in these struggles? I think water is one of these areas where this shift towards going beyond production in the sphere of wider social reproduction is more easily made, is more easily visible. Yeah, because workers, when they leave the factory or their water corporation, they realize they also need access to water for themselves and their families. And so it's easier for these trade unions to say, okay, we don't just fight for jobs, wages and working conditions, but actually we also need to look at the needs of the wider community. And that's perhaps something which is not so easily visible if you look at the big strikes in this Italian Foxconn and in the Chinese Foxconn or Taiwanese Foxconn factories in the People's Republic of China. Yeah, I think the link will be there too. Yeah, because those workers in Chinese Foxconn factories also have to live somewhere, and the exploitation extends from the workplace to the kind of lousy conditions in the dormitories, but perhaps it's not so easy to make that connection, not so easy as it is in the case of water.
Thank you for that, Andreas. Do we have any other questions? I've got a couple of points in the chat. So we've got Anna saying there's lots of Michiganders and Metro Detroiters here today, which makes a lot of sense. And Lisa says, Benton Harbor here in Michigan is also going for a water issue as we speak. Do we have any questions? Johnny, you've still got your hand up, but I imagine you've taken that down.
I think the United States are good examples of successful water struggles, but also the fact that these water struggles are currently coming up again. Yeah, and that you don't have these moments of final victory where you can say, okay, now this is settled. Finally, we have won and we don't need to deal with that anymore. And when I've been looking at these water struggles from 2014 onwards, really, and coming back after several years and speaking to the same activists, very often you could notice how people are really getting exhausted, because they feel that they're constantly fighting again over the same things, and that's exhausting. And I think capital relies on that, that people get worn out. And the various activist groups in the various countries and at the European level, whom I studied over the years, they're no longer as active as they used to be. But on the positive side, there are these kind of seeds, the residues of resistance, which are still there and ready to enlarge again as soon as it is necessary.
Thanks for that, Andreas. We've got a question by Joel. So if you'd like to ask your question, mate.
Sure. Thank you very much, Andreas. I really enjoyed it, and I think I need to preface this by, so I saw this talk, I can't really remember how it just sort of came across my desk, but I'm coming from a heritage background basically, and my research concerns the privatization of heritage spaces in East Jerusalem. So I thought I would come along to try and see if there's any parallels, anything that I hadn't thought about. And a couple of things sort of sprung to mind that you might be able to shed some light on. Was that the beginning bit of your talk where you highlighted all the supposed benefits of privatization. And then obviously you went on to say that these things in reality don't really materialize because companies are only really concerned in profits, and then things suffer because of that. And the parallel in my head was that the privatization of heritage is that the people who privatize it are only really interested in exclusivism and representing heritage for their own interests and the people who support them. And then I sort of thought about, in my field of work, one of the biggest bodies that is responsible for making sure these spaces and these companies and these organizations are fair is the UN and UNESCO. And it made me think of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I wonder whether you had any experience of these companies that are trying to take water private, trying to privatize water. What accountability do they have to governments that have signed up to the SDGs, if any? And sort of on the flip side, have you seen any examples where UN pressure has helped in causes and fights to prevent privatization? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joel. Very, very interesting question. The United Nations has been important. Yeah, it was in 2010 that water was officially declared as a human right. That was very much due to the pressure by water activists, first and foremost, Maud Barlow from Canada, together with then also the Bolivian state. In 2010, water was declared a human right by the United Nations. And this really allowed then the European Federation of Public Service Unions, when they formulated their European Citizens Initiative, to latch onto that and said, well, we want that the European Union establishes also water as a human right. And now some people say, oh, just to refer to water as a human right would be a kind of a liberal individualist strategy. But it was quite clear in the European context that the European Federation of Public Service Unions wouldn't have been able to say we are against privatization, because that would have been outside the remit of the European Union, and it would not have been possible to go down this very clear anti-privatization, almost kind of anti-capitalist direction so openly. But by latching onto this water as a human right put forward by the United Nations, you could then formulate the European Citizens Initiative in a much broader way. So you still include the resistance against privatization, but you also include this focus on water as a human right for development purposes. So the demand was that the European Union should push for water as a human right in its external trade negotiations. And that, of course, then allowed you to enlarge your alliance, including then also some development groups. So in that respect, the United Nations, not by saying this should be done, but as a kind of a framework, did facilitate this kind of water struggles. Now, when it comes to water corporations, they, of course, have also become more sophisticated and subtle in their strategies. So you go on their websites and they say, oh yes, fantastic, sustainable development goals. We are fully supportive of them. With our latest technology, we are key to ensuring that the water goal can be achieved. And so they are quite clever, and they're very good in the way of how they shape and form their discourses and how they push them. And one really has to be careful. Yeah, this notion of greenwashing that of course also occurs in the water sector. And so a lot of the struggle also takes place within this discursive domain in this respect.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Andreas. We've got a question in the chat before I head over to Tony. So someone called Frey Watt saying, thank you for a very important intellectually engaging seminar. Could you say how the so-called ethnic religious conflicts mask the expropriation of labor, land, water, and natural resources in the global south, especially in Africa? Would you like to take that one?
No, that's fine. That's very good. So how does that play out in the global south? And of course, we would need to look at concrete examples. And I have focused on Europe in this respect, but South Africa is one of these areas where we can see about the exploitation around water and where these different dimensions come together. The racialized nature of exploitation, where often the drive towards privatization is at the profit of large northern transnational corporations. And of course, also the kind of gendered nature of exploitation, because so many communities in their daily life rely on access to water and are often prevented from that access because prices are too expensive once privatization has taken place, and their access is simply being blocked off. Yeah. So in that effect, of course, this water privatization dynamics, they are part of, as some people would say, a wider neo-colonial strategy of how exploitation continues today of the global south in comparison with the global north. And we can see those different dynamics of capitalist accumulation, the access to cheap nature, the racialized nature of exploitation, but also the continuing expropriation of unpaid labor and social reproduction, how that all comes together in that issue of water privatization. And some people who have looked at, I think in the city of Durban, but also in the city of Durban, especially looking at water privatization there, they have done specific research on those issues within the context of South Africa.
Thank you for that, Andreas. I'll move to Tony Burns now, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, actually, the reason why I put my hand up was because I noticed the question in the chat, but as you mentioned it, I'll ask one anyway. So I was just thinking, Andreas, about the relationship that exists between ownership of land and the issue of the privatization of water, because obviously historically, I think struggles around water have often been have involved people who own land that perhaps has a water source or water running through it, denying access to that to other people access to that water. So there's just this general issue, isn't there, about land ownership? I think. And I know you're sort of applying a Marxist theoretical framework to your empirical study, and of course Marx talks about industrial capital, and the main focus of volume 1 of Capital is, of course, the conflict between capital and labor and industrial capital. It's in volume 3 where he talks about land ownership and rent. So I was just wondering how all of that fits into your analysis. Do you say much about the issue of land ownership and actually land as a commodity? I mean, it's an interesting point, actually. You say that people on the whole are very resistant to the idea of privatization of water and treating water as a commodity, but historically, actually, people haven't had the same reservations about land ownership, have they? It's not been the same issue, I think, for many people. So anyway, perhaps could you just say something about that? And as an aside, nothing to do with that, but I was thinking about all the films that I'm familiar with where the issue of water has had a, because I'm interested in politics and film. So Chinatown would be a very good example. And of course, Manon des Sources, Marcel Pagnol's, which of course, again, is about, but anyway, a literary representation of water struggles. I think that's actually quite an interesting thing to consider. I don't know if you do that at all, but I would be interested in that. Right, so that's two things.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tony. Starting with the latter one, I think, you're right, there are interesting films. And there's also one, Even the Rain, yeah, which combines an analysis of the historical expropriation of the whole of Latin America by the Spanish, yeah, and Columbus coming there, and the kind of disaster which unfolded and for the Americas as a result, combining that with an analysis of the Cochabamba water war. Yeah, so Even the Rain is certainly an excellent film to watch, and Even the Rain. So they now even want to make us pay for the rain. Yeah. So that's an interesting film in that respect. And land ownership, you're right, is not so questioned in our European context. But of course, if we went back to the 15th, 16th and 17th century in England, yeah, and the enclosures of the commons, that was of course an enormously topical area of struggles and resistance. And perhaps the fact that it is no longer so the case today is very much also due to the fact that we have become so used to this private ownership of land that we don't any longer question it.
Exactly.
Perhaps it comes a bit to the fore when we think about these demands of the royal family, that they should rewild their large, extensive landed properties. Yeah, that's where people suddenly think, but hold on a second, how comes that they own so much? Yeah, sorry, Tony, you want to?
No, I was just thinking. It's a while since I looked at the figures, but I remember when I did. This is some time ago, being shocked actually at how few people in England own the land. I mean, there's 60 million people or so, and most of us are living in large urban conurbations, and the vast majority of the land is owned by just a few people. So the landed gentry and aristocracy of old, which people think has sort of disappeared as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, it's just not the case at all. They're still there, and like the people like the Duke of Westminster still own half of London, or you know, sort of. It is actually astonishing, actually. Yeah.
And there was actually, as part of the wider Corbyn project, that George Monbiot, he put together a research project. There's also a publication available on the web. I think it's called something like Land for the Many. Yeah, so they were trying to tackle that uneven land ownership. So I think it is still an issue, but it's not as much part of public perception as in other areas. When we come to other parts of the world, however, when it comes to the expropriation of indigenous land, this is very much at the forefront. Yeah, and especially in the indigenous people in North America, they have never accepted their expropriation, and they continue to fight to that day the fact that they had to cede land, yeah, that they were expropriated by force. And a lot of the ongoing struggles, especially in North America, United States and Canada, by indigenous people is also over access to land rights, and thereby their access to the water.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So going back to the chat, Michaela's made a point in relation to land ownership, saying there's a wonderful book, Who Owns Britain, that documents land ownership across the UK. Ariana is asking a question, saying, thank you for a great presentation and discussion. Could you say more about the insights that approaching water struggles as social reproduction struggles could give to social reproduction theory and or autonomous theories of social reproduction? That's over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, the very notion of the commons lends itself very nicely to this kind of autonomist struggles. Yeah, and one set of approaches within feminist historic materialism, they come from this kind of autonomist background. Silvia Federici, for example, and they look at the commons, and also as a result, water would play a key role into how can we create our alternatives in parallel to existing capitalist structures. And so that's how the kind of struggles in production are brought together with struggles in social reproduction. And then there's an alternative tendency who would still look at the commons as a kind of a transformative potential beyond capitalism, but they wouldn't just focus on the kind of setting up this experiment in parallel to existing capitalist structures, but there would be more focus also contesting the kind of dominant capitalist structures directly. Yeah, but water as such does play a role within social reproduction theory, within its various different strands. And in a way, in the research for the book, I've been also inspired by this feminist social reproduction theory and their focus on struggles on issues such as water, but also cleaner air, for example, or local transport, or pension systems, or how the care economy should be organized. So that's quite significant for when we think about struggles which go from production into social reproduction and how we can conceptualize that from a Marxist perspective.
Thank you for that, Andreas. We've got another question from Elif.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks a lot. Congratulations, Andreas. When I was listening to you, I had two things that came to my mind. By the way, I recently read that Spain government decided to support young people for rent up to 250 euros, if I'm not mistaken. So I was also thinking that when listening to you in quick QA. The two things that came to my mind is first, did you come across with any organic link to struggles of ecology, environment? Because I think they are somehow very much linked with each other. Though it looks like European capital groups are also, I don't know, but like internalizing this climate change, because I recently came across with a report of European Roundtable on climate and green economy, etc. But was there any organic link, like alliances, linkages between ecology and environment? And the second thing is more like a curiosity. It looks like a very interesting fieldwork. Would you like to share a moment, like something all in your experience in the fieldwork, something that you would like to share with us, like a point where in which you think this is really progressive, or a point or a moment which was very impressive for you, interesting for you? Would you like to share some insights about the fieldwork? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elif. Good to see you. Thanks for those questions. So when it comes to struggles of the environment, the main connection in the research was in relation to environmental groups being also involved in the struggles over water, because they realized the kind of essential nature of water for the environment and for our wider life basis. And of course, they know from the struggles around the kind of green economy. Yeah, some people try to tackle climate change through the market. And of course, these kind of solutions exhibit the same kind of problems which happen when you attach a price to water and you think that would suddenly magically deal with potential scarcity. Yeah, so these environmental groups see the parallel in these struggles, and that's also why for them it was an easy step to come into these alliances against water privatization. Importantly, though, not all environmental groups. Yeah, there are some environmental groups, there are some green political parties who believe in this kind of solutions through the free market. So in Ireland, interestingly, the current coalition partner, the Green Party, as well as various non-governmental environmental organizations, they were not part of the anti-water charges movement. Yeah, they actually actively advocated that we should allocate a price to water. So there are differences within the environmental movement itself. And then an experience from the fieldwork, what I thought was quite impressive, and that was in the Italian city of Naples, which is the only Italian city which transformed its water company into a fully public company, not operated by the profit motive. It was a water engineer from that company, as well as a water engineer from the water company in Athens in Greece. And you could really see in the discussion about water their pride into their work. Yeah, they said, I'm really proud to be working for an employer which has as its focus to provide citizens with an essential service at an affordable price. Yeah, so you could really see the motivation of those water engineers was not some kind of personal position or certain levels of personal income, but it was working for a public provider of an essential service for the good of wider society. And so they had really a pride in their employment, which made me think, actually, I would like to have this kind of pride within my own job of higher education. Yeah, but then looking at the UK wider sector, and that's a totally different topic now, but it has been so become so commercialized and commodified. But I think this kind of same feeling of being involved in the kind of providing some wider good of wider importance to society doesn't exist any longer in higher education. And then these water engineering really express that, this satisfaction of being involved in providing this essential source for citizens at an affordable price.
Thank you for that, Andreas. We've got another question by Gorkum.
So hi everyone. It's nice to see you. See so many familiar faces. An excellent presentation. Congratulations on the book, Andreas. I was actually wondering because you showed an image from Italy that it had a religious reference. Have you come across any more of these kind of references in your fieldwork in Greece or in Ireland as well? Because it's very similar to actually what we saw in the anti-capitalist Muslims in Turkey, when they were saying like the land belongs to, the property belongs to God, and it's all about this land ownership, and then like it shouldn't be private and needs to be needs to be seen as commons. So have you seen any more kind of examples? It would be very interesting to compare actually.
So another example would be certain German development organizations from a religious background. Yeah, they were actively involved in water because they too would see that water is this essential source of life, and therefore everybody should have access. And when it came to the European Citizens Initiative, what are the key goals? One of the key goals was also that the EU should support this notion of water as a human right in its external dealings. And so a lot of development groups, which often come from a religious background, they were actively involved in this kind of undertaking. Now, of course, religious groups are not automatically progressive. They're not automatically reactionary either. Yeah, and so in the Italian church, at the Catholic Church, it wasn't the church as a whole which was behind the initiative, but there were key figures, individual priests, some youth organization, the Scouts, yeah, which heavily participated in the campaign. And I think it does show this unique quality of water. And we see that in other parts of the world with other religions, yeah, which similarly support these water struggles because it is viewed as such an essential source of life.
Can I chip in with something there? I was thinking about food, actually. Human beings need to eat as well as drink. So similarities and differences between food and water. I mean, you mentioned religion. I was just thinking. I mean, Thomas Aquinas didn't think that somebody who was starving, if they took comestibles without paying for them, he didn't think that was theft, and he objected in the Summa Theologica to the suggestion that this was a wrongful act because it amounted to an act of theft. So it's a historically very interesting issue there, I think, about how, particularly the case of Christianity and the Catholic form of Christianity, their attitudes towards, I don't know what Aquinas would have said about water actually, but he certainly had opinions about food, and I think probably held very similar views about food being an essential, essential for life, as the kind of views that you've presented to us in the case of water. So I think there is this tradition, certainly within the church, the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Would be interesting, of course, to explore that further, Tony. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's clear to see how these Catholic groups could base their support for water struggles on the actual teaching of Christianity. Yeah, it doesn't mean automatically that every Italian Catholic was actively supportive, but when it came to the referendum, quite a few of Italian Catholics who would normally vote for center or center-right political parties, they also, however, voted against water privatization.
What about air? Has anybody thought about privatizing air if they could? I mean, it makes you wonder. I think in Tokyo they sell air, don't they, and bottle air, oxygen on the street. So it is a commodity there, I think, to a small degree. Anyway, yeah.
That would be another twist, in the kind of story of capitalist expansion into new profitable investment opportunities.
Before I go to Chun-Yi, we've got another question in the chat from Danny Stevenson saying, thank you, Andreas, for your time and presentation. My question is, how do you think water will play a role in the future, especially in light of the climate crisis? Also, what solutions for these problems do you think we'll need to tackle?
Yeah, but very good question, because some people would say, oh, look, I mean, water is scarce, so we do need to find one way of dealing with it. And water scarcity, well, some people would say you give the right price, other people say you need to administer it. And of course, one shouldn't downplay the danger of scarcity and climate change. Of course, again, also the pollution of our environment with plastics increases the pressure on water resources. But I think, as political ecologists point out quite well, of course, there are water shortages, but the real problems we see are not because of the natural shortages, but they are because of the way of how we deal with them. So our colleagues from Turkey, there are big dam constructions in the east of the country, and that causes all kinds of harm when it comes to access for water for local populations. But these harms are politically inflicted. That's not necessarily because suddenly there's a lack of rainfall. Of course, that can intensify the situation. And so when we look into the future, the question is a matter of how is it politically managed? And this idea of the commons and this idea of a much wider participation of how we manage our water resources, I think has a much better possibility of ensuring that water is fairly distributed, rather than this kind of privatization at the interests of large corporations.
Sure. I think a similar observation could, again, to go back to food, be made about famines, couldn't it?
Yeah,
the tendency to think that famines occur because there's a shortage of food, and of course, many famines, that's not the case at all. It's actually because of the capitalistic social relations and having to do with the ownership and for the distribution of food. I mean, I think the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, 1 million people died, and they were exporting. Landowners in Ireland were exporting potatoes, so there's no absolute absence, as it were, of potatoes to feed the population. It was entirely to do, I think, with the private ownership and unequal distribution of the product, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, late Victorian Holocaust is this book, which discusses India and the famines there.
Sure. Yeah.
Anna makes a good point in respect to this discussion, saying clean air is connected to a commodity already, as land and healthy locations are already a commodity. So that was a good point.
Very good.
Chun Yi, if you'd like to ask your question.
Not exactly a question, it's added to the air that we discussed earlier, like Tony just mentioned. It actually happened in China because previously that there was a very severe air pollution. So it's happened that China was buying air through Taiwan. So that's a cross-trade situation. But you see, that's cost, it does happen, and it's manipulation through over the investment and over the political implication, air, land, food, and water. All that essentials, and as I see Anna's comments on the chat box also mentioned that it's actually all connected together, and they do share the fresh air with the Taiwan characteristics. So it's just a small comments on that, and not a real question.
Thank you. Yeah, very good.
Ertan, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks for the presentation. And I was thinking, and you also mentioned that, and so I wanted to share, comment, and ask the question that you also mentioned that in the Black Sea region, northern Black Sea region of Turkey, in the last 10 years, those resistances very much intensified. And that made me think a little bit, I mean, there are tons of different resistances movements in the northern eastern part of Turkey, and some of them were very powerful, some of them were suppressed by the military, etc., right? The military was also involved. So do you consider different forms of commercialization of water? Because, for instance, in the eastern part of Turkey, the Black Sea region, all these privatizations were not, privatization of water was not, as you also mentioned, they were not materialized by privatizing the distribution of water, but it was through those hydroelectrical dam projects. Exactly. And sometimes they were not even necessary. I mean, Turkey has electricity production surplus because they thought that, you know, Turkey will grow 5-6% annually, and didn't. So we have actually electricity surplus. But the whole project of this construction of the hydroelectric dam is, you know, a part of capitalist accumulation strategy model that they adopted recently. So, do you consider those different forms of commercializing water? Thanks a lot for the presentation again.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ertan. Very good question. Of course, yeah, you're right. It's not just the privatization of water and sanitation services, which is how capitalism tries to make a profit out of water. Yet the large dam constructions are very much, as you rightly say, in order to generate energy, yeah, and that then leads to problems. There's lots of extractivism industry, the tar sands oil industry. I mean, it's a catastrophe what's happening in Alberta and Canada, and the kind of huge, massive pollution of water resources in that particular area. There's bottled water. Yeah, it's yet another form of exploitation. There's the kind of land grab for export agriculture, export cash crops, yeah, which is often in the best areas where people then produce for the export, and then they don't have access to water and land to produce food for themselves. So these are all different areas. And in the book itself, I mentioned that briefly at the beginning, but then I focus on those European struggles. Yeah, but you're right, when we look at struggles over water at a global level, we need to touch on all those other areas. These struggles are connected, and they are again connected because they are in resistance against this expansionary dynamic of capitalism to constantly go into new areas of profitable investment. Thank you.
And we've got time for another question, maybe a couple more. Görkem, if you'd like to go for it, mate.
Yeah, thank you. Not a question really, just just a point just came to my mind. There's also, like, we could see water being used not necessarily as a commodity, or as also like a political tool, like in the context of the Northern Cyprus and Turkish relations. So there has been actually some literature being going on. Actually, they were actually calling it like the hydro hegemony of Turkish hydro hegemony applied to Northern Cyprus. So we could also see water being used as a political tool, political weapon as well.
It's often with the damming of the water sources, what happens to the countries or people who live further down the stream? What about their livelihoods? I think there's the Mekong River in Asia, which is heavily affected by dam constructions, leaving people without access to their livelihood, who lived on the agriculture and especially on the fishing in those waters. So it's huge destructions as a result of that.
So we've got time for one more question. And Sinem, if you'd like, it's good to see you. If you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Andreas. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
It was interesting because since I've heard the name of your project, I started to remember the movie Even the Rain, and you mentioned this movie. It was really exactly matched, and historically also it was also a good reference for the colonization. Well, my question is about whether maybe you mentioned in some details and I missed this point, but is there transnational networks in terms of water? Because we know there are some, for instance, Greenpeace is a kind of transnational network, advocacy network for green politics or green movement. And is there a transnational network for these water struggles? And if so, what is the cooperation between these transnational networks and local actors? The local actors, I mean the actors that you had interviewed or mentioned, the NGOs or informal groups, loose groups, whatever. Whether do they have some kind of connection or kind of pressure group for the government or the other private organizations? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sinem. Very good question. Of course, there are a lot of informal connections and informal institutions of how these water activists are in touch with each other, but there are also some formal institutionalizations. So there's the European Water Movement, and they still meet on an at least annual basis, bringing together different activists from across the European Union. At the moment, there's a heavy focus on the Balkan countries, where they try to sell the construction of small hydro power plants on these Balkan rivers as a kind of a green solution to the energy problematic of these countries, disregarding completely that there's a vast destruction of the environment and these rivers as a result. And so there's resistance mobilizing, and that's also being brought together at the European level by the European Water Movement, which then organizes kind of solidarity actions and ensures that this kind of destruction remains on the radar, visible also at the European level. There is the project by Maud Barlow, this Canadian activist who was behind the Declaration of Water as a Human Right in 2010. It's called the Blue Communities Project, where cities across the world can become a blue community if they sign up to certain principles, such as phasing out bottled water. And that is gathering some pace. Yeah, it allows activists to continue mobilizing around water. So in Thessaloniki, they became a blue community, I think in 2018, and it helped them to keep the water issue alive, which is difficult because activists becoming exhausted. And of course, that does provide them some kind of international connections, including with activists in Latin America and their networks in that particular part of the world. So some formalized institutions and a lot of informal ongoing connections there.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's all we've really got time for today, but I'd like to thank you again, Andreas, for that really engaging and interesting talk, and also everybody else for really interesting questions there. I'll have to ask a question to Andreas when I see him next in person. That's the pleasure of having him as my supervisor. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.